So I'm very interested in hearing more from the people here about this interaction between experts, the choice of experts, how experts contributed or didn't contribute to this public policy, because as I look out on what happened in retrospect, I see a lot of things that went wrong. And I'd like to hear more about how things worked, obviously with the eye to thinking about how things might work better in the future. So with that introduction, I'm going to now introduce Étienne Bassot, who's sitting next to me here. He's the Director for Member Research Services, and you are going to give us also a brief introduction before we launch the roundtable. So Étienne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. It's always a pleasure to be in Florence in such an inspiring environment. And thank you very much, Gabi, also for organizing this. And when you came to us with the idea of organizing a roundtable and to try to look backwards at what David was describing as a difficult time for decision makers, we immediately said yes, because I think we need to take reflection. We need to step back and try to look with this distance to what has happened, and take the time to think about this crisis of an exceptional magnitude, hitting the world, the economy, our lives, all of us, directly or indirectly, health, of course, but also the work condition, teleworking, of course. And it has been also hitting institutions like the European Parliament. I was earlier this week on Tuesday meeting old friends from the UK that I hadn't seen since the COVID pandemic, and we were just thinking back again what we were doing a little bit today, how much of life has changed. You know, these vaccination campaigns you were mentioning, the restriction of freedoms, curfews. I mean, a word that we didn't use since the last World War II. Quarantine, something that is more, making us thinking about the Middle Age than the current time. And all this, we have gone through all this. And we have gone through adaptations that were unthinkable, restriction of freedoms. And I think it's important to think about this human dimension of the COVID crisis, as it is very central to this crisis. And I think it's a good starting point for our reflection today. From the point of view of institutions like the European Parliament, quick decisions had to be taken on the way forward, and these decisions were not easy for the ones that were in charge. I'd like to mention here and pay tribute to him, to President Sassoli of the European Parliament, late President Sassoli, who died, as you know, in January, and he was in charge of taking these rapid decisions, courageous decisions on various fronts, access to buildings, conditionality of vaccinations or not, distanciation, remote participation on voting. So it's a challenge for democratic organization of the Parliament. And he was always relying on scientific advice as much as it was available. And we know that there were also discussions at the time. But there was one point that was absolutely central in his action, is that democracy didn't stop. And that was extremely dear to him, that the Parliament, although we had sometimes closed doors and difficult access, but with technology and so, we were managing to vote even on this instant legislation, this quick legislation, and not to stop European democracy. And I think this is a very important element. I mentioned this question of democracy, and it's a crucial element of our discussion, democracy in terms of crisis. Crisis tends to lead to exceptions, special procedures, reinforcement of the executive branch of government to the detriment of parliaments, to the detriment of public debate. And we know out of experience that there is a strong link between expertise, availability of expertise, and a strong parliament. What makes the European Parliament strong is the access to expertise. And with this expertise, you can challenge the executive, you have checks and balances, and you have a vivid democratic system. So a parliament needs to be independent, needs expertise to be independent. And that's why our seminar today is so important. Keeping expertise central to decision-making despite crisis is crucial to well-functioning democratic systems. So we in the EPRS, Wolfgang and myself, we are happy to share our experience of this difficult time and to draw lessons out of it and to hopefully become better for the future. And we are happy to do this in this framework, Gabby, that brings us together, that are more practitioners in the institutions and colleagues from the academia that have a different perspective, and to share our views and to come to common findings together. So thank you again. I'm looking forward to the exciting discussions this afternoon, and I wish you successful debates. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you very much, both of you, for the initial words and the framing, and also welcome from my side to everyone here in the room and in the online world. We also have colleagues from both the academia and the Brussels institutional side joining us online. We are going to discuss today the role and the impact, the success of science advice during COVID in two different roundtables. The first one that we're starting now is focusing on the generation and use of knowledge and on the impact of COVID on science advice and policymaking, as Etienne already mentioned. So we will look into challenges in general, but also having a look at something that is a bit of a red thread through the two panels on the role of social and behavioral science as compared to hard science. The first panel will deal with experience from EPRS, but also trust in policymaking, trust in experts, trust in politicians, and deal with policy learning, very interesting insights from Ellen on instrumental and social learning. The second panel, the second roundtable, will then focus on lessons learned, and we will go more into questions of how communities of experts are framed and integrate the wealth of knowledge that is out there. Maru will talk about that a bit more. And we will also talk about how we translate that into more resilient policymaking, so the foresight anticipatory part of the exercise and the extrapolation to other global crises that are different in character than COVID crisis, and Annette will talk about the climate crisis in that regard. So for the first panel, I'm very happy to welcome three great speakers, and it's a huge pleasure to have you here, all the three of us. Etienne, and David already mentioned that, is Director of the Members Research Service of the European Parliament's Research Service. He's leading the work since 2014, and before that he was working for IMCO and DEVE committees in the Secretariat, so Internal Market and Development. And he was also advisor to Nicole Fontaine in her time as president of the European Parliament. He has 2 degrees, one in law and one in European integration studies from both Nancy and Saarbrücken University. Next online, and hello also to our speakers online, Ellen Wayenberg, who is professor in public policy and administration of the University of Gent, and she's co-founder and co-chair of the European Group of Public Administration, the study Group 4, that is dealing with regional and local governance. And that's also a very interesting element for us to understand how the multi-level character of governance potentially went through and came through in science advice. She focuses both on public policy administration in general, but also on policy analysis and evaluation. And finally, we do have, and I don't see him on the screen, but I'm reassured he's there, Paul Cairney, who's professor of politics and public policy at the University of Stirling and a fellow of the Academy of Social Science, and super well known to all of us in terms of his work on theory, practice of politics and public policy. He has worked early and intensively also in evidence-informed policymaking, policy process, and the particular focus on UK and devolved administrations. And his contributions indeed bring a wealth of understanding of how expertise and public policy development comes together. Paul will speak last. He will tell us a bit about the trust element. Ellen comes in the middle, talking about policy learning and expertise supporting policy learning in times of crisis. And Etienne now starts with his insights from policy advice, science advice in times of crisis, and the expertise of EPRS.
Thank you very much, Gabi. Again, welcome everyone, also the colleagues online, and nice to have this roundtable with Hélène and Paul. So I'd like to structure my presentation in three elements. First of all, share our experience concerning how we tackled the crisis of COVID in the EPRS, European Parliamentary Research Service, then make a little comparison with the crisis of the year, namely this war at the east of the continent. And then third, I will highlight our research work on what we call future shocks, which is something that is an outcome of these two crises and other crises. So first, the COVID crisis. I said this was completely unexpected. It was, if you like, a black swan in foresight. It was something that had a low probability, but had an immense impact. So something that was not excluded in foresight work, but that took us really by surprise. And it was also something that we didn't see coming in the European Parliament from the point of view of business continuity, namely access to buildings, remote votings, organization of European democracy. So it was also a challenge for the Parliament as an organization. I think, nevertheless, that we reacted quickly. So in the EPRS, we went very quickly in teleworking and confinement. We had 1 week of total stop of activities. That was in March, but we prepared quite quickly and adapted our response to the members of the European Parliament. So they were, as you know, we do in the EPRS research on demand, and they were quite quickly coming to us. So what did we do in this first month from March to May 2020? Of course, research and publication on the health situation. That is something that we were asked to do by the members. Very quickly, we had to respond to inquiries and to publish on other related issues: free movement, Schengen, restrictions at the border, something that we didn't know really that it could happen. So closure of the border, free movement, and then of course the economy, closure of enterprises, and everything which is about supply chain and domino effect, as you can imagine. Also concerning the adaptation of the Parliament, I was mentioning what was very interesting for the parliamentary community is to see what others are doing, you know, what other parliamentary communities are doing in terms of lockdown, remote voting, exceptions, and so on. So there we had a role in explaining what was the solution that were envisaged by other assemblies. And towards the summer 2020, we were, the EU, after a certain while of let's say, silence and looking for solutions, was finding this political answer that we call a Next Generation EU, which is a big package of money, loans, and grants that are aimed at boosting the economy. This was adopted by the European Council in July, but this was something that was suggested by the Parliament in resolution already in May, and for which we have done quite a lot of work also in the EPRS, and there you see our role. And of course, in the EPRS, we did quite a lot of dedicated newsletters on all these elements. Members' interests, if we look at some figures, we had plus 171 research inquiries on health in comparison to the year before. So we had really a big interest on health issue, and they represented more than 10% of the overall requests on health. And of course, we don't have so many health experts in the EPRS, so we had to shift resources. We had to train quickly people, and they had to make readings in order to be able to answer to the members' inquiries. Concerning members of Parliament, so members were trapped also in the lockdown in the first week, so they were at home and they didn't enjoy the assistance that they used to have when they were in Brussels or in Strasbourg. So that was also a new role for us to provide to them. They were more relying on us in this time. Very important in this time, the first lockdown, was the speed of the digital transformation. I think it's something you have probably experienced. All colleagues were equipped with hybrid computers, were able to work from home. Problematic at the beginning that it becomes a sort of mainstream. But also our internal processes change rapidly, so I don't want to take you through the adaptations of the administration, but just to give you an example, we had debates for years about digital signature, and in 3 weeks it was solved. We had digital signature in the parliament. So it was really a booster for digital transformation. After a while, we restarted in the EPRS events like the one we have today. They were in the EPRS all on site before COVID, and then they became online, so purely online WebEx event. After a bumpy start, they became more professional and sophisticated. And it's important because it was a way for us to reconnect with academia. And it was also an interesting way to enlarge our audience. We used to have more, the bubble in Brussels of students and let's say, people that have access to building, though. So people from the Brussels bubble. And then all of a sudden we had students and an audience worldwide, and also easier to mobilize speaker for 1 hour of event rather than making a trip to Brussels. And that's actually an interesting element. We were in telework, and what we miss in telework is a certain form of human exchange. So you can imagine, I'm sure in the university world that you had same. So we had to create such exchange online. So we did some research project that we called writing circles to sort of force people to work together and to connect and to solve an issue together. So project teams, we're still missing this element of exchange. So we might come to this in the discussion later, but I think that, again, the human management, or what we call resource management, human resource management, was a big, important challenge for us. You can imagine that our staff are expats in Brussels, so they were not allowed to visit their family, isolation. Some of them didn't speak French, so they had only this sort of local environment, and it was an aggravating factor. But overall, if I look back at this COVID crisis, I think we managed to have business continuity, but more than that, because we were able also to put new things on the table. So I will call it sort of continuity plus as a takeaway. I like now, as my second point of the presentation, to say a few words about the war of the Ukraine, the war that Russia launched against Ukraine in January this year, February this year. So there were signs and warnings after the previous attacks against Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia that there could be such an attack, but we were all taken by surprise about the scale of the attack and the brutality of the crimes. And that is something that was hitting us as a community, because European integration is about peace. It's about solving disagreements and conflicts with cooperation and legal mechanisms. And all this war is about the contrary. It's about territorial claims. It's about domination of a neighbor. It's about something completely different that brings back to our reality of today the darkest images of European history. And it came as a shock to all of us also in the parliament. And what was striking in the parliament is that people, members, staff needed some tools to understand what's going on. And we saw immediately a role for the researchers. So what we organized some what we call policy hubs. So these are forums of exchange with experts and our own population, members and staff, where we discuss a certain issue, but they are not public. And we use this format, and these policy hubs were on military operation, as you can imagine, energy crisis, to understand what's going on there, but also such issues as the rivalries in the Orthodox Church between Moscow and Constantinople, the history of the relation between the two countries, very complex, of course, the migratory and asylum wave. And all these issues we felt that there is a need for people to discuss. We had up to 300 people for such policy hub, which is much more than what we have normally, much more than our audience. And it was for us a role as the internal think tank to understand what's going on, but also to define policy options in the answers. Mirroring these meetings, this policy hub, these forums of reflection, short publication on all aspects of the war and the domino effect. And a challenge that we had, that was a new one to us, is the new role of the EU in the military response. As you know, the EU is not a military alliance, it's an economic and political organization predominantly, and there were elements of security and defense, but it's not comparable to NATO. But there we had really new developments with the purchase of the lethal weapons, which is really a step change in the development of the EU. And we very quickly saw that there is an issue of information there, because it's very difficult to aggregate what the EU is doing, what the member states are doing. And we were often said, well, it's an issue of military secrecy, but we could see that actually behind this, there was also an issue of delivery gap. So member states making big announcements in terms of assistance to Ukraine, military and non-military, it could be also humanitarian, and then a delivery gap. So a task for us was to track these delivery gaps and to explain and to try to find the data and to give it to our members. And again, that made them stronger to scrutinize the Commission, but also in that case, Council and executive branches of government in general. In terms of inquiries by members for individual research, we had 9.6% on the war in the 3 first months of the war, so from February to May. So there were really about security and defense, military operation, of course, a lot of related questions. I can say that we felt also an anxiety about the state of the world economy and all the changes that were appearing. And sometimes when you are a researcher, you just can't answer to this. It's something that people were really anxious about, the change of the world, all assumptions that were questioned. And the big concern of the members of parliament we could see in the question is the cost of life. Inflation, on energy, but also beyond the cost of life. And we could see the pressure of the voters to the members of parliament, and then the question landing on us. And of course, you don't have always the answer. You give some elements, but you don't have always the answer. So we needed also agility in resources, as we needed to have during COVID, where more people had to work on health issues, although they were not trained for that. But then on this cost of life, we had a lot of questions. So that's how we responded to this. The crisis of the war is, of course, different from the COVID crisis. No need to explain. I'm sure you understand that. I'd like to insist on one difference, is the geography. COVID crisis was about all of us. It was hitting as much Portugal and Spain than Cyprus and Finland. We're talking about behavior and psychology here, and some colleagues were much more concerned about the war that Russia launched against Ukraine than others because of the geography of their own origin. Relatives in neighboring countries to Ukraine or Russia, much more refugees in some of the countries in Eastern Europe. And of course, it affected their perception, and it affected their sensibility to the topic. And I think it's something that we as managers have also to integrate and to think about. So that was about these two crises, COVID and the war. And that brings me to my third point. I'd just like to share with you our work on risks and capabilities, which is also called the work on future shocks and policy responses. And if you Google EPRS future shocks, I don't have slides, but you immediately find this study on future shocks, as it is quite visible in the internet. And it's a major research project that we have developed after the COVID crisis had started. So we developed it in the spring 2020. And the idea is very simple, is to try to make horizon scanning or foresight on what could be the next shocks or the next big shifts, and to see how much we are equipped to respond to them. So it's as simple as that. And if indeed you look back, started with 9/11, the crash planes on the Twin Towers. We had experienced a succession of crises, the financial crisis in 2008, various terrorist attacks in Paris, Brussels, and else in the EU, the first invasions of some territories in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, the big wave in migration 2011, COVID was mentioned, but I think also in the summer last year of these floods in Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium, these really extreme climate events. Of course, we all think about climate change, but we didn't think that this part of the most wealthy part of Europe will be hit by climate change, like, you know, Sri Lanka or Thailand and so on. That was really extreme floods. And then, of course, the war, and we don't know what is the next. So there is common features about this crisis. So there is always an EU reaction of some sort at a certain moment, but it is largely ad hoc. There is a time lapse between crisis and answers. The answers are predominantly intergovernmental. So, and we see a role for the European Council, clearly, that takes the leadership. And sometimes, I would say, dare to say often, it's outside of the treaties. Think about the migration crisis agreement with Turkey at the time. And it's outside of the EU budget. So it's extra tools that are invented, like NGEU is invented. So it's a response, yes, but it's not in the. So it's a challenge for the European Parliament. It's a challenge for what I was saying in my introduction about checks and balances, about democracy, and so on. So having that in mind, we have tried to do a systematic work of scanning of possible future shifts and shocks. And I just want to give a quick read of this, not for taking note, but to show you that we have tried to scan them in a wide perspective. Very obvious Russia brutal expansionism, extreme weather events, very high energy prices, another major pandemic, question mark, escalating public debt, risk, stalling economy, semiconductor supply chain disruption, growing democratic fragility, collapse of the internet, algorithms undermining political debate, deepening and pervasive social divisions, EU spending capacity under threat, new China shock, question mark, slowdown of the Chinese economy, question mark, acute stress at EU borders. So that was 15 sort of shifts and shocks that could appear. And in front of them, we have tried to elaborate policy responses. So something that we could do as a response at international level, EU level, but also national and local level, and try to see where are the gaps where we actually don't have the tools. And I give these sort of blocks of EU responses just to give you an idea. So climate proofing the EU, strengthening our energy security, promoting economic recovery and resilience, establishing greater strategic autonomy for European industry, consolidating strategic ties with democracies, building a healthier online environment for healthy democracies, safeguarding EU and global food security, strengthening European Defence Union, consolidating EU internal security, responding better to future pandemics, building a European social model for the 21st century. And then we have looked at the Horizon 2029, which is for us after the next election, which is a nice political time frame in terms of the perspective of the tools. And we try to see what's in the pipe, what is being done, and what could be done, what is not done. It's not agenda setting, but it's flagging tools, flagging possible answers that then political levels can embrace. So, and this work on the future shocks, and we are going to do it every year. So we are now in the process of looking at other issues, completing, enriching, and we expect to issue this in the next spring in order to play our full role as EPRS. With this, I come to the end of my presentation. I have given examples on these two crises, COVID, then Russia, and then try to say how we have adapted and how we are looking more broadly at other crises, and presented our work on the future shock. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Étienne. And thank you for touching upon very important points that will be taken up by other speakers during our two roundtables. So first of all, what we saw is with COVID it was in terms of the advice that you gave, a very narrow focus on the health situation. You said the economic implications, supply chain, so very much health economy, understanding what type of interruptions the EU was facing and was in need to prepare for. Interestingly, quite immediately, we have this comparative element in there where you try to engage in institutional learning. So looking at other parliamentary assemblies to understand how they deal with informing MEPs. So we have here also a type of institutional learning in how advice was in-house provided. Ukraine, completely different ballgame, it seems, because of two elements, the geography of it, making the threat perception very much different from the more homogeneous common threat perception of COVID, but also bringing something in that I think even now we do not have wrapped our heads around, this cognitive emotional aspect of providing evidence in a situation that touches upon the very essence of European integration, peace on the continent. So here, also the instrumental adaptation that needed to retreat a bit from the public to offer safe spaces for discussion, what you said with the policy hub. So you had institutional learning that offered this space for a bit of potentially a more raw talk internally, so that people could have a more steered way of combining their thinking with the advice that was giving. And interestingly also, while we had in COVID the understanding, the immediate understanding of the consequences, it seems that Ukraine brought more advice in terms of forecast, but also even more foresight. You said the resilience requests, thinking about the future, what could hit us in the future, all these questions about making the system fit for future shocks was something that the other dimension the Ukraine added. So here also the embedment of the parliament within the system, the change of decision-making mode. So us and them internally, not only geographically, very interestingly. So very much to talk about, and very much also to touch upon by our next speaker, Ellen. Ellen will talk us through different modes of policy learning. How can we learn in crisis? How have we learned within the policy, within COVID? And what does that mean also for epistemic policy learning? How can we make sure that the advice that we need, and we saw how much it differed in between crises, is integrated into science advice systems and is heard in policy making? Ellen, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being here. It's a great pleasure having you.
Okay, thank you very much for organizing this wonderful event and for inviting me here. I will now try to share my screen, so hopefully this will work. Yes, this one, and I'm almost there, I think. Okay, is that clear for all of you?
We have you, perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, today I would like to talk to you about good use and generation of expert advice during COVID. Would like to zoom in on some factors, mechanisms that can help to understand what has been going on, and also to look at some challenges that we have today as well as tomorrow. So the contribution I want to make here today is primarily based upon research that we have been doing from Gent University, focusing upon the Belgian case. So as you know, Belgium had some of the world's highest infection and mortality rates at the beginning of the pandemic. Our government had to take quite severe measures at times. And of course, Belgium became a very interesting case for research for us. And we zoomed in on the Belgian case from various angles. But probably the one most relevant for the roundtable here today is the one you already mentioned, the one of policy learning. So we put a policy learning lens on what was going on in Belgium. So let us have a closer look. Well, what became clear? First of all, it became clear that COVID-19 is definitely a case of epistemic policy learning in Belgium. So two conditions were fulfilled. On the one hand, the government and the governmental officials were confronted with a lot of insecurity, uncertainty about that new virus. They did not have the expertise in-house. On the other hand, there was expertise available in society amongst the groups of experts, groups of scholars, the so-called epistemic communities. And so a whole process started of knowledge and expertise being infused into the policy-making process. So such a process can take place, or such an infusion, in several ways. And we primarily zoomed in on two of these ways that are very well known. So first of all, knowledge from epistemic communities can be used to fine-tune instruments, to sharpen them, to make them better, and so on. So so-called instrumental learning is then taking place. On the other hand, knowledge from epistemic communities can also help to reformulate policy goals, and even a whole new policy paradigm can be created. That can happen as well. And in that case, we speak of social learning. So these were basically the two learning modes that we used to make a so-called longitudinal analysis. It's a bit of a relative term here, because it stretched, the analysis was stretched over a period of 2 years. We looked at the beginning of the pandemic in Belgium, that was January 2020, until the end of 2021. And basically, throughout that 2-year period, we could basically distinguish 3 time blocks. In each time block, we could see another form, another type of learning coming to the fore. That did not mean that the other type of learning did not prevail. Both types can prevail at the same time, but there was always one type more dominant than the other. And that's basically what we try to visualize in that figure on the left. So we made a thorough in-depth analysis of all kinds of different elements indicating those forms of learning. And you can see an overview of that here. But of course, I do not have the time now to reflect upon all of the elements mentioned here. That's why on the right side of this slide, I mentioned a referral to a recently published article on that topic. It's an open access article, so you can definitely find more information there. So what happened now during those different periods, I will try to give you some background information here. So for the first period from January until June 2020, the pandemic started in our country. Policymakers were very insecure, didn't know what to do, they were in panic at times, and basically they turned to the experts for advice to help them. Experts did come forward and they helped to fine-tune measures. The measures, the interventions in the beginning were primarily oriented towards healthcare facilities, because the government, of course, wanted to keep elderly homes open, wanted to make sure that hospitals stayed operational and so on. Because yes, at that first period, the COVID crisis was primarily seen as a public health crisis. At times, very drastic measures were taken by our government, such as lockdowns, putting down a curfew, and so on. And at those times, sometimes the policy makers asked the experts to step forward and to even address the public directly, and to support the governmental actions that were taken. So in that way, the experts provided not only the knowledge to policymakers, but also legitimacy for their action. And they kind of became very powerful in that beginning period. And when I speak of experts in that first period, well, then I primarily refer to medical experts such as virologists. But then gradually, when we came to the mid of 2020, the situation started to change a bit. There were various things going on. For example, the political debate, opposition came forward more and more with regard to the measures that the government were taken. It was also becoming more and more clear that citizens did not accept the strict measures. There was a lack in compliance there, because the measures were very strict, and it also became more and more clear that COVID did not only affect us from a medical point of view, it also had a tremendously big economic impact. It affected our well-being socially as well as mentally. And so a whole new dynamic started then, and during that whole dynamic, protest grew also against the experts that had been given advice to the government. Why? Well, because the medical expert had become very powerful. Some people even claimed that the medical experts who were making policy and it were not the policy makers that were doing what they were supposed to do. So a whole debate came to the fore then. And at points, the protest against the experts became so heavy that the policymakers actually had to mediate between, on the one hand, the medical experts, and on the other hand, the public or certain groups within the public. So that was a bit of a crazy situation, but due to that situation and that whole dynamic, policymakers did start to realize, okay, something has to change here. We cannot continue with our policy like we have been doing that before. And so adaptations were made, interventions were turned back, and also expert advisory groups were recomposed during that second period. And that recomposition meant that not only medical experts had a seat in those advisory groups, but also experts from other disciplines were invited. Sociologists, economists, psychologists. So more and more people coming from the social and the behavioral sciences. And during I'm still going that second period. So during that period, the policymakers themselves also try to find a new role themselves. A clear example for that was our then new and still current Prime Minister De Croo, because at one point he clearly started to go forward and he said, okay, we have to look at COVID now in a different way. It is a virus, it is here, we have to deal with it, we have to start and learn how to live with it on the long run. And that was basically the start of a new paradigm that we can see in policy making. And of course, there was a new paradigm. And so in the aftermath of it, it was necessary that policy instruments would be adapted as well. So that we could live optimally with that new situation. So that's why we, from the end of 2020 until the end of 2021, marked a third period in which a new cycle of instrumental learning was coming to the fore. New instruments were created, and maybe one of the most important instruments then was the installation of a so-called Corona Commissioner, who was put in place to actually coordinate all the actions that were going on over the different sectors, over the different levels of government and so on, so that we could actually start living with COVID in the long run. So in short, throughout these 2 years, we definitely saw shifts in the way in which expert advice was generated and used. What are now important factors that can help to understand these shifts and also these different ways of learning and that knowledge infusion. So I have listed up several of these factors. Of course, that's not exclusive. New factors can be added, and we can definitely discuss all what has been put down here further. But first of all, what's important, of course, the nature of the problem of the crisis that was at stake. So in general, we label COVID as a so-called creeping crisis, and I've listed up here the different interlinked features of such a crisis. So in essence, a creeping crisis is multidimensional. It has various dimensions, and this makes it substantially different from a one-time shock event, such as a terrorist attack, or a natural disaster for which there are usually standard crisis procedures in place. But that's not the case when there is a creeping crisis. The situation is new. Policymakers are confronted with high insecurity, uncertainty. They need infusion of expertise, of knowledge. And that's exactly also what happened in Belgium at the beginning of the pandemic. Typical for a creeping crisis is also its long duration, so it takes a long time, and throughout the time there are waves. So the crisis issue will be intense at one point, less intense at another point, and again that variation affects the request or the need for science advice and the infusion of that advice into the policy. And in combination, the multidimensionality and long duration of a creeping crisis that lead to a situation in which more and more people will be affected by the crisis issue, but not all at the same time or in the same way. And of course, then the threat perception amongst the public will be different. which also again will impact upon requests to go for science advice and how that advice will be used in policy. Of course, there are some other factors that play a role as well. So I've put on here the advisory system architecture as an overall label for several factors that can play a role. So what do I mean? Well, basically, in a parallel study, we looked at how epistemic learning took place at various levels within our governmental system. We looked at the national level, the level of the federal government, where the crisis was and still is managed primarily, just like in a lot of other European countries. But we also looked subnationally. So we looked at the level of the provinces, of the municipalities, to find out, okay, what exactly is going out there. By doing that, we could make some kind of snapshot from a multi-level governance perspective. We were limited in time, in space. We were also limited in resources because we tried to get in touch with quite a lot of policymakers and experts, but they also did not always have the time to give us an interview or to share their findings. Everybody was and still is quite busy, but nevertheless, we tried to bring some findings together. And I think the most important one is, of course, that the learning processes that were and still are going on, they differ at the different levels within our governmental system. So let me try to clarify that one a little bit further. So at the federal level, government was pressurized at the beginning to take action. And so the structures were set up, linked with existing structures. At one point, it was the case that no less than 14 different national crisis response and expert advisory structures were in place, so quite a lot. And that's why some people, more outside of our governmental system, labeled this whole situation as a so-called COVID-19 labyrinth. But on the other hand, this is Belgium, and you know that in Belgium, we can create quite complex structures because we want to have consensus. We like to balance out everything. At one point, for example, there was a so-called regional imbalance amongst the structures being put in place on the federal level. What do I mean? Well, the Walloon and the Brussels region, they had critique because they said, okay, we are underrepresented in those advisory structures, and the northern, the Flemish region is too much represented. And so they said this is a regional imbalance, we have to adapt that. That happened, and that's again typical for our way of working in Belgium. So at the federal level, a lot was done to have those knowledge infusion processes structured, formalized, systematized, and so on. We did not see quite the same at the subnational levels, at the level of the provinces and the municipalities. Let me try to make that one a bit more clear. So at the provincial level in Belgium, we have 10 provinces. And a province is not led by an elected representative, but is led by a state official who has a certain leeway in organizing the knowledge infusion process. And we definitely saw that governors used that leeway to create the situation that was optimal for them. Because some governors, they opted to really reach out to the scholarly society, to really get in touch with academics, as well as with experts on the local level, the mayors, for example, in order to get good information and to use that information in their decision-making. There also were other governors who did not do this at all. They completely relied on existing risk structures, and they were happy with those risk structures functioning as they had always done. And then we had some governors that took a mid position there. They did rely on existing risk structures, but at the same time, they also reached out to fellow governors in order to get some extra advice, some new information, new knowledge, and so on. So that was a process that we put there in the middle. So that was basically what was going on the provincial level. Then, of course, we also have got the level of the cities and the municipalities. And there we could say that actually the whole learning process was even less structured and systematized than on the higher levels. The processes that took place in response to what the public wanted, or at least what mayors thought that their public wanted. For example, in a university city, that meant that the mayor really got in touch with local scholars. But when you look then at municipalities, more rural municipalities, they did not have academics on their territory, and so such processes did not happen. And some of these mayors they even told us, okay, we do not need that expert advice infusion. We know ourselves what is going on in our locality. So there was a huge variety there of how the learning processes were organized. But of course, this variance, and especially then on the subnational level, also points to characteristics of policymakers themselves as being important to understand how knowledge is used and generated. So let me zoom in a bit more on that one. So how do the policymakers themselves see their role during a crisis? We really saw some variance there as well, in the sense that some policymakers said, okay, we have to be the expert ourselves, and we have to have a lot of knowledge infusion, whilst other policymakers know they had and preferred the position of a generalist, and they said, okay, it's nice that there is so much expert advice outside, but we have what we need to have here, and we continue from there. What also differed, among the policymakers is definitely their experience in working with science advice. Some of them really had a good local network. Sorry, I need to have to drink a bit. Sorry. So some policymakers really have a good network, a scientific network. We met one governor who had a background in academia. And of course, she valued the expertise from academics a lot. And she really wanted to infuse that expertise into her decision-making, whilst others did not take that position at all. What's important as well is, of course, how the policymakers themselves view the crisis, what kind of priorities they have towards the future. For example, a couple of months ago, our current Prime Minister, he stepped forward at an event of his own liberal right-wing party, and he clearly said, okay, during COVID, I had to take measures that are completely against what I'm standing for. He was then referring to measures such as putting down a curfew or deciding how many visitors one can have at his home. Because for him, the COVID period was really a period of listening to the virologists. But now, and he was then referring to April 2022, now it is time again to listen to economists. And so an expert group on purchasing power and competitiveness was then put in place to give advice to government, to make the recommendations so that the economic position of a country would get better. So clearly our Prime Minister took the stance of saying, okay, I want to be a conviction instead of a consensus politician. And in that way, by taking that firm stance, he clearly responded to a criticism that was uttered several months ago before by the heads of our Flemish universities, the so-called Flemish rectors. What do I mean? Well, during the pandemic, the rectors took the initiative several times to jointly write a so-called open letter in which they addressed the policymakers. At one point, for example, they urged the policymakers not to ignore the science advice when they were handling COVID. At another point, they said towards the policymakers, okay, it is not acceptable, not healthy to hide behind scientific advice when things go wrong. You are the policymakers, you have the mandate to make the decisions, and that's what you have to do. So again, at several occasions, these open letters were there. And a couple of weeks ago, there was another open and joint statement coming from all our rectors, but not directly appointed towards the policymakers themselves, but appointed against two scientists. What do I mean? Well, in September, there were two professors who launched a call for a so-called independent assessment of the Belgian COVID-19 response. They are well aware that there have been several impact studies on the Belgian situation, but those two professors say no, these impact studies, they are too narrow. They do not look at long-term effects. They primarily look at medical and not at social effects. So no, these impact studies, they are not enough to actually learn what has been going on during COVID, to adapt ourselves and to be better prepared to go towards the future. So that's basically the reason why they launched this call in September. And by now, when we're a couple of months later, more than 7,000 people have already signed this call. So they get a lot of support. Although the rectors, the heads of the universities said, no, it's too early now to do such an evaluation at this point. It will come in time, but only when we're all less emotional about COVID and about everything that has been going on. And this actually brings me to a last point that I want to make today, because of course, generating science advice and using it, it's not so simple, it's not so straightforward. There has been a lot of interaction, a lot of commotion, conflict as well within that triangle there of policy versus science versus the general public. It's not easy to use science. Some even say using science is a science in itself. So we'll have to see. It's still a bit too early. I agree with that statement, that we still have to wait a bit before we can evaluate, okay, COVID, has it actually changed something permanently in that triangle or not? So again, we'll see. We'll have to research that, and there will definitely be some interesting times there towards the future. Thank you. That's what I wanted to share here today.
Ellen, thank you so much. You brought actually summarized and analyzed the process, a very complex process of a very multi-level country excellently, and showed us also the how the dynamic of the crisis environment impacted on 3 different cycles of learning. First one starting with the very strong focus on vertical community, epistemic community and expertise, building and injection into the policy process, having this narrow focus on healthcare facilities, medical aspects, and then something that Paul in a second will take up, trust. So the turn from the first phase of instrumental towards the first phase of social learning being required by lower citizen compliance, potentially also distrust in experts, when you said that medical experts seem to be doing policies rather than informing them. So here, the element of trust being important, and leading towards a horizontal widening of epistemic community in impact and injection of expertise into the policy process in the social learning phase. What I think is important to take away, and we will discuss that further, I think, over the next presentations, are 2 things. First, the immediate governance impact. So multi-level governance arrangements have a strong impact because they multiply perceptions on how science and science advice should be channeled and injected into the system. But they also open the door for a broader variety of bounded rationality of actors engaged in science policy advice. Different justifications, different perceptions of the role of policymakers as experts or as clients of science advisors, and hence a stronger focus on how do we deal with that? Is it a science in itself? What do policymakers need to learn? What does the community need to learn? And how do we deal indeed with trust? Ellen, I thank you very much for your presentation, and hand over directly, Paul. Hello, haven't seen you on the screen, but yeah, there you are. Hey, and wanted to hand directly over to you. What does trust of politicians and citizens of following policy and regulatory approaches. Citizens trust in the capability of science, and also politicians trust in science. How did that impact science advice during the crisis?
Okay, thank you. Hopefully I'll talk about some of that. I actually tried to engage more with the wording of this session about the success of science advice. So I think trust is a part of that. I think I put it in that context of what makes it successful. I'll try and look competent sharing my screen first. Can you see that okay?
You are.
Okay, and then there's a little button to make it a slideshow, isn't it? There we go. Okay.
It's not yet on presentation. Yeah, it is. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So I just started thinking about what it would mean to say that science advice was successful in some way. And I thought these are the first things that came to mind. And so in terms, a lot of this is the UK context. So I think the first thing is, a science advice architecture exists. And I think one of the striking things about the UK experience is that at least until COVID-19, I think the UK had a really good reputation for its science advice architecture. You know, if you went to lots of, evidence and policy workshops, the UK tended to be one of the ones that other countries wanted to emulate in terms of the existence of science advisors in each government department, the kind of formalization or institutionalization of science advice, and the kind of science advice they gave to other countries during crisis. So I think, or at least I've heard that the UK had this decent reputation before things went a bit wrong during COVID. So that would be the first measure of success. Are they actually prepared to provide this advice in a systematic way? So the UK, has chief science advisors, that's what CSA is. It has SAGE. So SAGE, I think, it became quite famous in the UK. I don't know how well known it is outside of it, but it's the right, I should have written the whole thing down. Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. And previously, the emergencies tended to be infectious diseases in other countries that it was providing advice for. This was really the first time I think it was tested in terms of advice given to ministers about a problem that was happening in the UK. And the third thing that's worth mentioning in terms of the architecture is about the intergovernmental relations. So the UK government has its own science advice mechanisms, but it also tends to coordinate science advice information sharing between the UK and the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. So, for example, they each have their own chief medical officers and they meet regularly to share information. So that might be one measure of success, that they actually have institutionalized science advice. So policymakers like ministers rely on it routinely. I think the second, probably the more important one, is the policymakers actually trust their science advisors. And so I haven't defined what a science advisor is yet, but I think that's that kind of key thing throughout this discussion about, if policymakers are going to access or look for science advice, who do they think they should be talking to? Is it anyone with good information or is it specific individuals? I think the third thing is that those scientific advice mechanisms are able to deliver good information to reduce uncertainty. So I think that tends to be the focus of a lot of science advice literature. This is about providing high quality evidence to reduce uncertainty among makers. They're not quite sure what's going on. They ask advisors to give them basic information. But I think most political studies are really focusing on that fourth thing, which is the extent to which science advisors can engage with policymakers to reduce ambiguity. So ambiguity there would be, there are many ways to interpret policy problem or problems such as COVID. And so, should and could science advisors engage with policymakers to influence how they think about the problem as well as give them information about it. And then the fifth one might be, the ability to foster policy learning. I don't feel I need to talk about that very much because I think Ellen did such a comprehensive job before me. So I thought I would focus on those, number 2 and number 4, your trust in science advisors and their ability to reduce ambiguity. Okay, so I think in this case, we're talking about, can you measure success in terms of a good working relationship between ministers and their science advisors? And I think, so one of the papers I did on this is to try and relate the actions of potential science advisors to the actions of interest groups. So I know that this is a tricky one, because I know most scientists don't like to think of themselves as lobbyists. In fact, they wouldn't use lobbying, but they would talk about advocacy or advice or something like that. But I think there is a very kind of strong parallel with the strategies of science advisors and the strategies of interest groups. So I think at least in the UK policy communities, kind of classic literature, you can find this distinction between 4 types of, insiders or outsiders. And, number 1 being the one you want to be, and number 4, not so much. But number 1 would be a core insider. So that would be interest groups who are consulted routinely and asked to negotiate with policymakers on a range of issues. Then you have the idea of specialist insiders who are consulted less routinely on much more niche issues. Then I think you have most interest groups are called peripheral insiders. They are some part of an exercise with government, but it tends to be a trawling exercise or a cosmetic consultation where people give their views, but they're not particularly influential. And then you have outsider groups who are either outsider by choice, as a strategic aim, or because their beliefs are so inconsistent with governments that there's no room for negotiation between them. And I think you can map that onto, the strategies that groups might adopt and that science advisors might adopt. So I think in terms of what would influence a policymaker reliance on interest groups, it tends to be that we talk about, they first support a government's legitimacy and their ability to frame a policy problem. Then they have some kind of resources that they can offer to policymakers to be consulted on a regular basis. And then they follow the so-called informal rules of the game in each venue. So in the UK, that would be something like this. It would be, they would define a policy problem quite narrowly, often to describe it as a problem that has been solved or requires only technical expertise, so they can limit participation. Then they tend to agree to these rules about keeping any debates in-house. You don't talk about them outside government departments. They present modest demands rather than radical demands. They accept the fact that they're going to lose out in the short term, but they might win in the long term. And they, crucially, they don't criticize the outcomes in public. I think the policy communities term is important there, because the idea is that this is all done with communities of people who form bonds with each other. They can trust that that whatever they talk about behind closed doors, they're not going to hear about in public. So that'd be the kind of classic policy communities position. And I think you can map it on to science advisors. So UK government ministers in 2020, in the run up to the lockdowns that most European countries introduced in 2020, you had a lot of government ministers talking about being guided by the science, and a lot of skepticism about what that meant or how rhetorical or misleading that was. I think it tended to mean scientists, and what they meant is our chief science advisor and our chief medical officer. So they would be the core insiders who were, the best place to speak on a regular basis with ministers, and the most likely to follow these rules of the game, partly because they were civil servants. They were also subject to formal and informal rules about their conduct. So they could meet those requirements, and they tended to be the conduit between most science advice and ministerial advice. Then you have specialist insiders, so that would include SAGE. And so SAGE is an interesting thing. If you look at their meeting minutes, it suggests that at each SAGE meeting, there was a range of between 40 or 100 people who attended SAGE meetings to give, to talk about information or to generate advice. There were also smaller subcommittees on, for example, behavioural advice, but the main plenary was far too big to be a decision-making body. So what tended to happen was they would have a relatively small group of people would talk within these meetings, and the results would be relayed to ministers through, for example, the chief science advisor. So they would be I think specialist insiders, clearly listened to, but not with the same direct access to ministers as the chief science advisors. Then you have, I think, most other potential forms of science advice would be peripheral insiders. They have something to offer, but they either don't know or don't follow these rules of the game and really have no sense of how to be listened to compared to those other bodies. And then you have outsiders. So we had a body called Independent Sage, which self-described Independent Sage, a sort of group of people who came together to try to mimic the functions of SAGE, but do it on an open basis and be relatively critical of government. So there was no chance of them really negotiating with ministers because their positions were so different and they were so critical of it. So I think in most cases you have most scientific, potential scientific advisors who were not particularly consulted, and that's partly because they didn't know about the rules that would be, how to follow the rules that would be effective, or they didn't follow them through choice. And some of that, I think, is to do with the rules that you find within science advice or within science, which is sort of contradictory to the kinds of things I talked about. So, for example, I think lots of scientific advice principles are about transparency and challenge and open discussion, that sort of thing. And that would go completely against the rules of UK government, which is that you're not transparent, you keep things behind closed doors. And if you talk about these things, then you won't be invited back. Okay, so the second measure would be, can science advisors engage with policymakers to reduce ambiguity? Can they be influential in terms of how policymakers define COVID as a policy problem? Okay, so I think this is a list, at least in 2020, of how the UK government tended to define COVID-19 as a policy problem. So first thing that they would stress, a lot of it was implicit, but sometimes explicit, that the UK would define COVID in relation to being a liberal democracy. So the UK government run by a conservative government that was relatively focused on individual responsibility and markets over state. So it would emphasize that if there was to be state intervention, it would be temporary or it would be largely about exhortation. So until mid to late March, the UK government's definition of the problem was, this may be an infectious disease with large consequences, but we don't really want to force people to do particular things, at least until mid-March. Then there was an assumption that the epidemic or the pandemic can't be eliminated, it had to be managed, so it couldn't be eliminated without a vaccine. And at the time, there wasn't a vaccine, so this was about management of an epidemic rather than trying to achieve things like zero COVID. And the third thing, I think, is what characterized UK and other country approaches. They talked about using suppression measures to protect the National Health Service from being overwhelmed by acute cases, to shield vulnerable people, and to reduce death to the extent that they kept the transmission rate below 1. So I think that did sort of contradict with other approaches in other countries where essentially the R was to be as close to zero. This was to be high suppression to minimize infection. I think the UK approach was not to do that, even during a lockdown, I think. And so that's partly because they expressed this belief about the need to avoid excessive suppression measures. And at the time, it seems like a long time ago now, but at the time, the argument was that if you have too strong suppression measures during a first wave of COVID, and then you release those measures, then you will produce a much higher death rate during the second wave. So that was very within UK government narratives. And instead, they talked about focusing on gradual measures so that you can build up a series of measures to try and learn from which ones are working, to avoid panic and to maintain trust in governments, essentially by not having a too suppressive regime. And it would focus on this need for an exit strategy to remove suppressive measures as quickly as possible. And it would largely relate that to fostering economic growth, getting people back to school, and protecting the NHS, that sort of thing. Okay, so the key points from those things I would say is, in terms of going back to that question about successful science advice, I would say ministers definitely relied very heavily on their chief science advisors in the run-up to the first lockdown in 2020. There are different narratives about essentially who was to blame for a too late lockdown in March 2020. And it's very hard to maintain the idea that ministers were too late because they were not listening properly to their science advisors. I think they were quite in tune at that point. The second thing is that ministers and their chief science advisors, two people in particular, defined the policy problem in very similar ways. So it wasn't that there was a tendency for ministers to make choices that defied the advice from their closest advisors. They were quite in tune with each other. And I think the third thing that would feed into the discussions we had about policy learning, I think any learning by UK government ministers, at least under this government, would be through that lens that I talked about, liberal democracy, limit suppression measures and such like. That's the lens through which they would analyse any feedback they got on their success or failure, and the extent to which they would seek to learn from success in other countries. I think in a nutshell, the UK government does not really want to learn from many other countries because it doesn't think they're solving the same problem. Okay, that's it for me just now. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, Paul. So what we've seen is that obviously ad hoc versus institutionalized structures have a strong impact on how science advice is delivered. But a very interesting point of your presentation is indeed to bring us a bit closer to something of a framework for status definition, to understand what type of role science advisors have in the system, and to link that to potential impact. That's a very powerful tool, actually, for us to have an analytical lens on the process and the success of the process. And the last point you made is very interesting on the overlap between assessment of science advice and ministers. So groupthink, and how far is a groupthink effect or trap narrowing down solutions that can be proposed or that are proposed by science advisors, and what potential problems that has for policy success and for crisis reaction success. Thank you very much for that. I don't have a direct view on the chat from here, so I would now like to invite those of you who have questions to our speakers, and I assume that there are many, to just raise their hand so that we can potentially bring them in. I already see Annette, if you want to start.
Yes, if I may. Thank you. I have one question for Etienne and one for Ellen, and I tried to be very brief. With regard to Etienne, I mean, there are at many public administrations and parliaments, people are trying to figure out, as you do, what can be the next crisis we have to face. And I came about that the fact that the idea is basically that maybe our science-based imagination might not be enough to figure out what comes next. And I came across the French Defense Ministry, which a couple of years ago hired science fiction authors and made them think about what is imaginable as next crisis. So all the area of speculative fiction. I just wonder if this is something you would be interested in. And with regard to Ellen, I would be interested in the role of federalism in Belgium. I mean, in Germany, the ideology is that federalism is a wonderful thing because it allows the states to react differently to different situations. But in the pandemic, they reacted fully differently to the same problems, and that sort of delegitimized federalism to quite some degree. And I wonder if you have similar observations in Belgium. Thanks.
Thank you, Annette, for your question. Well, in general, the Belgian case is known as one of coro-nationalism, as it has been called, because the federal government took the lead from the beginning in managing the crisis. But as far as I can tell, the regions initially were still quite calm with regard to intervening, and they followed the federal guidelines as well as the governments on the other subnational levels, but gradually they came more to the fore. And so that caused a situation at one point that we even had around, I think it were 7 health ministers at the regional / federal level, and both of them can be in our system called the central levels, and especially from the viewpoint of the municipalities and the provinces. So 7 health ministers operating there with all their different priorities, views, not always matching, and that caused conflict at times, especially from that viewpoint from the lower levels there. But yeah, in general, I would say federalism, it is quite different from the German system, where you have the competencies being much more clear, divided amongst the different levels. In our case, we have upcoming elections within a couple of years. Already, some parties are saying on the regional levels, yes, we need another round of state reform, so that we as regions can get even more competencies. And the whole conflicts that there have been between, on the one hand, the Flemish region, on the other hand, the Walloon and the Brussels region on COVID matters, but today as well on economic matters, it's still very well prevalent. So we'll see what happens exactly there. Will there be a new round of state reform or not? The elections will play a very big role, the upcoming elections in 2024. But definitely the COVID case, initially, it was definitely the federal government who took charge, took the lead, and was also accepted in that way. So you can say that's a bit of a deviant case with regard to what we're used to in Belgium, because it was accepted from the viewpoint of the regions. But the longer the crisis took on, as a typical reaping crisis, then we saw the regions coming more and more to the fore, and then our typical way of doing business in our state structure, became dominant again. So yes and no, I would say, if you can live with that kind of answer.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, I guess it's good to get the odd provocative question, isn't it? So thanks for that, David. I don't think it's fair to describe someone like Ferguson as a charlatan figure who's kind of, I wasn't talking about people.
No, to be fair, I was describing him as a pseudo expert, not as a charlatan.
Well, okay, but pseudo means false, doesn't it? It means that they're call themselves an expert, but they're not. But he has. So in Ferguson's case, he's been recognized not only as a senior person within his own university, but by the UK government. It'd be weird to call him a pseudo expert, I think. But what would you call somebody who forecast 200 million deaths and only 74 people died? You call him an expert? I'm just curious. I mean, I have a reason. I know, but it just seems like a weird. It seems like a weird focus to have on an individual. Yeah, it's just. I mean, I suppose that's my response. It's a weird fixation I think you have with an individual. I think if we're talking about a general,
if you like, I can talk about Paul Krugman instead. There are many examples of this. I picked on him because of the COVID-19 crisis, not because I have anything particular against him. I never met the man. I don't know anything about him, right? But he stands for a category of person, right? So let's talk about the category of person, not the specific individual.
Yeah, I think if you're focusing on what I would like, it's not this. I mean, if in terms of the question you asked, what can people do to become more prominent within a UK government process? Well, it's not about fiddling rules or developing a sort of a false sense of expertise. I think the bland answer is that the UK government has science advice mechanisms where chief science advisors who are civil servants are responsible for forming networks of scientists that they trust to provide them information on things. So they form wider communities. And I think that's the kind of approach that tends to be favoured as well within European Commission processes as well. You appoint formally people who have a kind of civil service role, and they then form their own networks of people that they can trust based on their status. And very little of that is about TV personalities or anything like that.
Thanks, Paul. Etienne?
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you for the questions and also for the interventions. The question of Annette about how we embed foresight in policymaking and how we are daring to go for the worst scenarios. I mean, what is important is the process. I think it's important that we question possible future and we build that link with the policymaking and see if we are fit for the answer. It's not about predicting the future, but it's about questioning possible futures. And in our role, also questioning the tool and the instruments that we have. In the European Parliament, we have also created what we call inter-service steering group for resilience. So it sounds very much like a bureaucratic entity. But what we're trying to do there is we are trying to do, well, if there is a cyber attack of a large scale, are our equipments in terms of IT fit? If we have a new epidemic, what is our medical service ready to do? What about an attack of China against Taiwan and then a disruption in the chip sector? What is the influence for us in terms of our operations, but also, I mean, of course, informatics, but also maybe the lifts of the building and things like that. So it's very, very operational. That's what we're doing. And last week, we even dared to question the nuclear risk because we think there is now a new risk. Actually, we listen to specialists on this, and it's maybe less caring that is, but I think the process is important for public institutions to question futures rather than predicting. So it's and there we would encourage to go for the more disruptive. Just like to add that there is a particular challenge for democracies. Sometimes it is said that authoritarian states are fitter for foresight because they don't have elections. I believe that an open society, I believe that public debate, I believe that transparency are actually assets, and we should make good use of it. We should bring these issues on the table, but confront or make this link between policymaking and foresight and expertise. I like also to comment, since there was an interesting exchange between a German and a Belgian on federalism and levels of governance. I like to say that there is also the European level, and the health is very interesting because there is very little in the treaty on health. But we saw that solutions were needed also at European level. When we were at the midst of the crisis, there was this exchange of patients in intensive care because there was not enough capacity in some regions, and there was a wave of solidarity. It was a bit ad hoc, but it happened that patients were sent from a country to another to get this intensive care. Then we had this purchase of vaccines. Imagine countries like Malta, Portugal, smaller countries, and these gigant companies producing these vaccines, and the negotiation without Europe, that would have been extremely difficult. Of course, Germany, possibly France, and others would have managed to buy them for a good price, but I'm not sure about others. So then there was a new role developing at European level, and we could mention other examples also now with the civil protection mechanisms and other things that have been done at European level. So I think crisis, this one and others, they also challenge our governance and the levels of governance, and should open our minds for new actions at new levels of governance, because maybe our structures are not always fit for the challenges. It's a general answer. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you to all of the ones that asked and that answered the questions, because you directly brought us to the next panel. So questions of foresight, questions of anticipatory governance, question of communities, of scientists engaged, of extrapolation to other areas will be very important for our second panel, where we will try to learn a bit what does the crisis tell us, what does the science advice that has been delivered tell us about the resilience of our society and the policy tools that lead to that. I suggest to now have a 12-minute break and to reconvene at 15:20. to give enough room for everyone in the second panel for a wonderful debate. And thank all the speakers of the first panel and all the participants that engaged in questioning and listening for their attention and for the participation. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so welcome everybody to the second session of the workshop. It gives me a lot of pleasure to be here for many reasons, including the fact that this is actually one of the first face-to-face seminars I've been to in a while. So this second session is devoted to, is entitled Lessons Learned from COVID-19 for Science Advice. I'm sure many of us have published papers with the word lessons or lesson in it. And I guess if you're a historian, you would say that we're sort of doomed to repeat them. But I think it's at least very important to articulate them. And that's the purpose of this particular session. We have three terrific speakers before us, and I'm just going to quickly introduce them, and they will be speaking in the order that appears on the program. So our first speaker is Maru Mormina, who is a senior research fellow at the Ethos Centre, as well as the Wellcome Centre for Ethics and Humanities at the University of Oxford. She has a terrifically interesting background, coming both from science as well as the social sciences, and has done a lot of thinking about what we're going to talk about, as well as the very important ethical dimensions. Our second speaker is Professor Annette Töller, who comes to us from FernUniversität. She's a professor of political science, working in the areas of environment and climate. And she also has positions in an advisory capacity for the German government. Our final speaker is Wolfgang Hiller, who's a director in the European Parliament's Research Service, where he is responsible for impact assessment and European added value, and he seems to occupy a very important position in these sort of intricate flows, knowledge flows that inform the workings of the European Parliament. So I'm very much forward looking to his talk. So without further ado, I will invite our first speaker to kick us off.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Gabby, for the invitation. I'm so delighted to be here. I'm trying to, let's see if this works. It looks like it's working. Yeah. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about lessons from COVID-19, for science advice. I'm not sure I can talk about lessons, but what I'm going to try to do very, very briefly is to, highlight 3 points of reflection. And I'm going to be very broad, very simplistic, very brief. And I'm hoping that we can unpack some of the nuances behind what I'm going to say in the discussion. So, how do I move this? Let me start by saying that we're talking about the COVID pandemic as the COVID crisis, but I want to acknowledge that this is not just one crisis. What we have here are many concurrent crises. And now they call them polycrises. In the old days, people used to talk about wicked problems. Now they're talking about polycrises. And the basic idea is that the interconnectivity of our global systems enables kind of a small problem in one part of the system to have repercussions in the entire system. Think, for example, of the ship that was grounded in the Suez Canal that disrupted the supply chain worldwide. And not only that, an impact in one part of the system can also affect other global systems. We've talked a little bit earlier on about the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine shows us that the risks don't remain confined to the system in which they originate. So what might have started as a geopolitical crisis produced crisis in food supply chains, food prices, energy prices, political instability around the world. So what might appear to be separate crises in reality interact, reshape one another to form a polycrisis that needs to be understood and addressed as a whole. So that's my starting point here. So I want to structure this intervention around 3 features of polycrisis, and perhaps kind of let you see whether these 3 features draw some lessons for science advice. And very briefly, the 3 features that I'm going to discuss are the question of risk uncertainty that we've discussed a little bit earlier. And when there is risk uncertainty, there is disagreement. And I'm going to suggest to you that under conditions of risk uncertainty, science advice needs to be able to make space for debate. The second one is the issue of complexity. Polycrises are complex. You need to understand them as a whole. And that demands joined up thinking. And that joined up thinking cannot be done unless we have diverse and inclusive science advice. And the third feature of polycrisis is that polycrisis present us with multiple layers of harm, and mitigating those harm poses very important trade-offs that can be incompatible. Therefore, polycrises are characterized by value conflict. And I'm going to suggest to you that science advice cannot disentangle science and values. The science advice needs to make space for both. So let me start unpacking the first point about risk uncertainty. Now, risk evaluation is at the heart of policy making. We've talked about this as well. So under normal circumstances, we might gather some data, plot it in a graph, run a simulation, and we might have some answer. I don't think it works quite like that, but under a crisis situation, this is even harder. The facts are incomplete because the situation is rapidly changing, and therefore the science is uncertain. And when the science is uncertain, it becomes disputed. And this is what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. Science did not speak with one voice. In the UK, this lack of consensus was very visible to the extent that we had the official science advisory group for emergencies, or SAGE, that we were discussing earlier on, and we had and still have an alternative body that called itself the Independent SAGE, which bizarrely included members that were also on the official stage. On a global level, we had the Great Barrington Declaration that supported the so-called focus protection approach and was quickly, and to my view, somewhat simplistically associated with anti-lockdown ideas. And in response to the Great Barrington Declaration, then we had the John Snow Memorandum that was kind of signed and published in complete opposition to the Great Barrington Declaration, and that also simplistically was associated with pro-lockdown ideas because they promoted an elimination strategy. So what I want to say is that science was divided into camps, and what these camps do, they try to discredit each other. They try to construe a consensus that was aimed, in some cases, aimed at excluding and shunning debate. I feel one needs to be critical of labels such as bad science or fake science or pseudoscience, because in some cases, these labels were deployed to assert one position and close off debate. So the first lesson, I think, is in terms of crisis, don't expect quantifiable answers, don't expect definite answers. As Fauci famously said, don't ask me for a number answer. A crisis, and even more a polycrisis, places in a post-normal territory characterized by uncertainty, and this requires more and not less debate. So the second point is the question of complexity. If a feature of polycrisis is precisely the interconnectedness of risks, it seems incompatible with rapid decision-making when one needs to reduce the problem to manageable parts. So, for example, framing the COVID-19 as a health crisis, as a single health crisis, may have enabled clear lines of accountability and responsibility to be assigned, for example, to health departments. But this resulted in the mobilization of rather narrow disciplinary expertise. Advisory bodies, as you all know, were around the world were dominated by virologists, epidemiologists, etc., with little representation of social science, anthropologists, etc., etc. And there are studies that have nicely documented this. Moreover, civil society was almost absent in advisory bodies and task forces. So, what is the consequence of such narrow mobilization of expertise? Was an emphasis on medical solutions. I'd like to call them technofixes, at the expense of more radical and systemic transformation that address the multiple and interrelated impacts of the pandemic, that address the pandemic as a polycrisis with their social, economic, and political dimensions. But also there's another consequence of this simplification. It gives the impression that the problem has a quick fix. Once we deploy the technofix, hey, job done. In the process, the long-term measures needed to build resilience are discounted in favor of short-term solutions. For all the talk that we had, remember in 2020 about the new normal and things will never go back to being the same, what we see now is a return to business as usual and a doubling down of the status quo. And I can give you, if you like, some examples in the discussion. But narrow expertise was not only limited to the overrepresentation of certain disciplines and underrepresentations of others. There was also little, advisory bodies were also very homogeneous in terms of their socioeconomic characteristics. This picture here is what comes up if you enter in Google Images, Science Advice UK, right? You can see there, 3 men, rather similar in their appearance, right? Women, people of color, LGBT, were poorly represented in advisory bodies worldwide. And consequently, although it was soon understood that the impacts of the pandemic were worse in marginalized groups, that these groups were the most affected by the pandemics, because their experience were not represented, were not fully understood by those bodies, the measures on these groups were not fully accounted for. And this exacerbated social inequalities. In terms of gender inequalities, we have that women experience greater economic precarity and income loss due to the pressure of childcare. It also resulted in measures reflecting middle-class concerns. I spoke to lots of colleagues in Africa who were saying, well, actually, you know, this COVID-19 thing is a middle-class problem. Our governments are shutting down borders, but you know why? Because the middle classes travel. The poor people in the shanty towns, they don't travel. Lockdowns, that's for the middle classes who have nice houses where they can self-isolate. In the UK, for example, nannies, typically service the middle classes, were allowed into homes because they were considered as essential workers, whereas family and friends, who are the essential network on which low-income families rely for childcare, were not allowed into homes. So the middle classes could have childcare, the poor couldn't. And there's also the geographic narrowness of expertise. Lots of people discuss during the pandemic, oh, this took us by surprise, we were not expecting, this is an unprecedented crisis. Well, let me tell you that at the time that COVID-19 was hitting Europe, Africa was dealing with hundreds of outbreaks. And to my knowledge, I'm not sure any advisory body went to African experts to say, well, how did you manage your outbreaks in the past? What did you do during Ebola? What did you do during the HIV epidemic, etc., etc.? So, yes, I'll leave it there. So the second lesson is holy crises demand truly and diverse advisory bodies. And this is because this is key to grappling with the complexity and building resilience in the system. As advice needs to mobilize multiple forms of expertise, multiple perspectives beyond quick fixes. Now, in saying this, I need to acknowledge the tension that this raises. the crisis situations demand rapid action, and these, I acknowledge, might be incompatible with debate and deliberation. So if I advocate for pluralism and inclusiveness, this means more actors, more dissent, more debate. It takes time. But it only takes time if we don't have the relationships, the networks, and the systems to bring together diverse group of actors in advance. So when we look back at the COVID pandemic, I think we need to look even further back and see what systems did we have in place so that, we were or were not prepared. And then this brings me to a suggestion, which is perhaps what we need is broader terms of reference in terms of the composition of advisory bodies, so who can participate, but also in terms of the scope, what they can do. Because often these advisory bodies are limited by the questions that they are asked by the policymakers. And in many cases, I think Paul was alluding to this, these questions are framed very, very narrowly and limit the ability of advisory bodies to have this systemic and holistic approach. Okay, so finally, my third point, and that is that of trade-offs and value conflict. The complexity and interconnectedness of crisis results in multiple layers of harms. Harms to the environment, harms to the economy, to society, to different groups, etc., etc. We know that. Solutions to address these harms may be incompatible. So, for example, face masks, they may reduce transmission, but then they're discarded. They end up polluting oceans and rivers. And this calls for a negotiation of values. So do we save lives or do we protect the environment? This is what science advises to deal with. On the other hand, so we have values entering these difficult trade-offs. On the other hand, we said that the science is uncertain because there is incomplete evidence. And this creates a gap between the questions that science is asked to answer and the facts available to answer those questions. And what fills the gap? Value judgments. Value judgments about how to interpret the facts, about what facts one needs to gather, about what facts one needs to consider, and what facts one needs to disregard. The idea of value-free science, it just doesn't hold water. So internally, science is not value neutral. Externally, science cannot adjudicate on value negotiation. And this suggests to me that when we talk about evidence-based policy, we can't leave the issue of values outside. Including values in evidence-based policy may require us to think differently about what we call evidence. Because in ordinary parlance, the evidence in the evidence-based policy is taken to be a scientific study of a body of research, something that is stable, out there, objective, neutral, ready to be picked up and translated into some magic form of advice. I would like to suggest that the third lesson that crisis like COVID-19 offers, where complexity and uncertainty are a constitutive feature, is that we need a much broader understanding of evidence, what includes scientific and non-scientific facts, values, and experiences. Evidence, therefore, becomes like an assemblage of practice and relationships in constant tensions and in constant negotiation, not that thing that is out there, immutable and objective and neutral. And if we understand evidence in this way, the upshot is that the evidence-based policy-making process must draw from a much wider constituency of experts. What I like to call the content experts, the discipline-specific and fact-gathering expertise, people like us, but also the context experts, communities, groups, individuals whose local knowledge and contextual understanding might not be available to the scientific expert, but without which the normative policy questions, the normative trade-offs requiring negotiations of values cannot be addressed. So what would this look in practice? Science advisory bodies as extended peer communities, to use a post-normal science terminology, where a broader spectrum of perspective and framings are brought to bear on polycrisis and their impact upon different systems and groups, so that policy options are not closed off, but are widened. So just to recap, We've been asked to look back and see if we can learn anything. So what did we learn? We learned that polycrises are characterized by uncertainty, by disagreement. I suggested because of this, we need more and not less debate. We need to be aware of these narratives of exclusion. We've learned that polycrises are complex and demand a plurality of expertise, and I've suggested that perhaps we need broader terms of reference for science advisory bodies. And we've learned that polycrises are normative. Values and facts are difficult to separate, and we need a broader conception of evidence that includes scientific and non-scientific facts, and this called for science advisory bodies to be thought of as these extended peer communities that bring together content and context experts. So I've been asked to looking back, but we need to remember that we look back in order to look ahead. So I want to finish with three very, very short thoughts. Crises are set to create the conditions for change. But I think that each history will tell us to what extent we've seized that opportunity for change. I've suggested that the expertise needed in a polycrisis is one that embraces greater pluralism, so that options are not closed off, but instead the realities and demands, especially of those most left behind, are not overlooked. And I would like to suggest that if we're serious about building back better and fairer, we really need to cultivate the virtue of epistemic democracy in all of society's institutions. With that, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Maru, for getting us off to a flying start with those three nicely articulated lessons. So I'd now like to invite Annette Töller. Is she?
Yes, she's ready, but I need to share the screen. Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay. Just a second. There we go. Okay, so do you see my presentation?
Yes, we do.
You do, okay. So thanks for having me on this very interesting workshop. And I think what my observations, which I want to share, fit quite well with what Maru just said. So just briefly, I just want to draw very briefly on my different perspectives on the issue. So as a policy researcher, I did some observation and analysis, especially of the German pandemic policy. My main focus is environmental policy research, and here I am also interested in the question on what impact crises have on environmental policy making, and also on the role and maybe also the proper role of policy advice in this area. And since a while, I've been a member of one of the two major advisory groups in environmental policy, giving advice to the federal government. And this is where you actually learn two things. One thing is to convince your colleagues from other disciplines why your perspective on the issue, different issues, is relevant, and then convince the people in the ministries or frame the issues you're interested in a way so they see political profit in it. So this is a very interesting experience, which also makes me look at things we're discussing here in a specific way. So the overall question I'm trying to answer is what can we learn? What can we learn from the pandemic for environmental and particularly climate policy politics, and what role does scientific advice play or ought to play in this area? Let me share some general observations. If we look at the pandemic and to a certain degree also the energy crisis we are facing right now, we can see that it brings structural problems which we have had before to the surface. Like in the pandemic, for instance, at least in Germany, the lack of digitalization of local health services, and now the war brings about the lack of funding of our military, and each crisis brings about a structural problem which we could have seen and faced before. The pandemic, like all crises, most crises, accelerates decision making. And what is very interesting, or what I find very interesting, is it emphasizes the role of the individual in achieving collective goals or solving the problem. And it also emphasizes the responsibility of the state in doing or getting the individual there. And this is very interesting because we are at the moment in this advisory council, we are working on a report on addressing the individual with its impact on the environment, which I know that in the UK there are similar reports, but so far this has been a very risky point to make. And now, due to the pandemic and also the energy crisis, the role of the individual comes much more into the center, and it becomes more acceptable also on a general note to address with policies what individuals do. So we also see unusually strong state intervention, and we are a bit surprised even that this intervention is obviously politically feasible, and it can also work. But at the same time, of course, that we see it can provoke resistance, and it makes people more susceptible, at least in Germany, to conspiracy myth and populism. At the same time, I think the pandemic clarifies that even in a crisis, no one holds a monopoly on problem definition. This is something which is very important in environmental policy, because there are not few like activists, but also scientists who claim to, that, the climate crisis is so important that nothing else can be as important. And this is, of course, a way this is sort of a monopoly, which I think can never be valid. And at the same time, we see that also in the pandemic, there is not one right policy, as our former chancellor used to say, without an alternative, but there's always a variety of policies which balance interests in society differently, as Maru already mentioned. So in the pandemic, at least in Germany, there were both the criticism that the scientific expertise was not considered enough, and on the other hand, people who said, well, it's the rule of the experts, and who criticized that because it's in the end, it's the politicians who are meant to decide. Let me say a few words on comparing the pandemic and the climate change, which obviously are quite different problems. We have differences in the time frame of the problem itself. The pandemic obviously is a very short-term problem, comparatively short-term problem, versus climate change, a very long-term problem. Also, the time lag, if we look at policies, between a policy and its results, the outcome or impact, is quite different, from days to weeks to decades and even centuries. And what is very relevant for politics is the distribution of costs and benefits. In the pandemic, we have a distribution of costs and benefits within the society between different groups, Whereas in climate change, we have a distribution of costs and benefits between generations, which implies a big challenge for policymaking. I certainly haven't full account of all relevant aspects, but what both problems do have in common is that they are invisible. And so they are highly dependent on science, and science has a relevant role in interpreting and explaining and offering solutions. So what in terms of public policy and the role of scientific evidence, and this is, I try to address both the pandemic and also the climate change problem. We see that when a problem emerges, we do not always have sound scientific evidence. We saw this especially in the pandemic. In a crisis, very often politics has to act even in the absence of scientific evidence, like in the early weeks of the pandemic. Scientific evidence is obviously always preliminary, and this is something which is very difficult to explain. I mean, we've seen all these high-ranking virologists explaining, like in Germany, to the German audience, how far their evidence travels, and they tried to explain, when they come up with new evidence that, what they said like 4 weeks ago isn't true anymore, and this is a very difficult thing, but of course it's very necessary. And then scientific evidence is limited to what has been researched. This is less trivial than it may sound, because from my experience, what politics asks you is be as precise and as concrete as you can, and please make us policy suggestions. And very often this is not what we can do from our research. So I think scientists have to communicate these limits of their evidence and try to restrict their advice to what they really have researched, which is very difficult to do. But otherwise, I think we risk the authority and also may pour fuel in the fire of populism, who challenge any validity of scientific evidence. Obviously, as Maru already mentioned, there is not one body of evidence. Very often, even in so-called objective sciences, evidence is contested, and various disciplines are needed to solve a specific problem. And we have had in the early days of the pandemic, like mainly virologists and like epidemiologists and these people, which were asked to give their advice, and only later on, like sociologists or pediatrics and other kind of people were asked. And of course, the disciplinary background has an impact on the solutions, or on the problems people define and the solutions they suggest. So, and also, whereas in environmental policy, we have quite established groups of experts which can be asked. And by the way, the government rarely asks specific questions, but the groups come up with issues themselves. In the field of the pandemic, we observed that politicians picked experts as they pleased, because there wasn't such an high degree of institutionalization, and this was changed with the new government. They established such a advisory body, and of course there needs to be more awareness of different disciplines, and there has just been a debate on this in environmental policy, where it was challenged that most of the people giving advice are like economists and lawyers and technical people, whereas social science are not represented in the same amount, which is definitely true. Well, and then, of course, more evidence does not automatically lead to better policy decisions. There remains ambiguity, as Paul also mentioned. Policy decisions require value decisions, and they have impacts on social groups, and there are automatically conflicts over who enjoys the benefits and who bears the costs. So in a democracy, such decisions can never be fully based on science and must be made by politicians. And I emphasize this because we had sort of a controversy with a colleague from economics who argued that the pandemic demonstrates that policymakers do have the wrong incentives to adopt the proper decision and to listen to the science, and this is why scientists should decide on such policies in such crucial areas, which of course is total nonsense, which we wrote in a replique on this. And beside the scientific logic, there is the political logic, which, among other things, means that we as experts should not expect politicians to follow our advice. We could hope for this, but we should know that they have a lot of other rationales to follow. So to come to my conclusion, if there are lessons which we learned with regard, especially to climate change policies, with regard to politics and administration, it is important to institutionalize a plurality of scientific perspectives, and it is also necessary, in my view, to clarify the boundaries between science and politics. And also politics shouldn't ask for advice which cannot be based on scientific evidence, but this does not imply that we should not talk about values, but we can also do research on values. So we should stick to what we really can seriously make statements about. So, and then science, of course, we should clarify the scope of our scientific evidence, as I already mentioned, and we should accept the plurality of problem definition and policy options when giving policy advice. And I would recommend to have a more political understanding of policy advice. We can help define problems, and sometimes, and this is something which I added this morning after having a meeting with the group and policymakers, sometimes we really have to try to sell our solutions, but this is a political process itself. It's not like objectively there are problems and then we scientifically find solutions, but this the process of policy advice itself is a political one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that comparison between COVID and climate. Indeed, climate has been one of the things that the Group on Experts has been talking about over the last few years. So that was an especially auspicious choice of cases actually for us. So I'll now hand over to our third speaker. Please take us away.
Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I think it's absolutely important to have this kind of conversation. Where I'm coming from, that's somehow the interface between politics and science advice. And I will be touching already about on a number of things which have been mentioned before by the two which have been speaking just before me, but also a number of issues have been raised already in panel one. My starting point is also, and I would agree with those who have said it, well, we are living in a moment of overlapping crisis. There's not just one crisis, it's polycrisis. I would add another word, Burma crisis. It's quite fashionable to speak about all these crises, but starting from COVID and looking at COVID, I will try to draw lessons which are valid for most of these crises, because in particular for policy advice, I think there's a lot to be learned, which is applicable in all of these things. So in the next couple of minutes, apart from saying some generalities, I would like in particular to focus on 3 points. The one is to remind us about the need to step up resilience and preparedness. We have heard this before already today. Number 2, the need to constantly communicate, which needs to be, which I'm adding on the list of things which we need to do, which is not science advice as such, but I think it's important for making sure that science advice can be successful. And number 3, lessons to be learned for better lawmaking. Well, starting with some general remarks, I think that we all agree that it's absolutely important that we have a sort of correct and efficient science advice architecture in place. And this not just when crises occur, but this has to be in place at all times. To have the instruments and the structures for this science advice. But we need to understand that science advice is a broad concept and needs to be applied to every aspect of society and decision making. We need science to understand the problems, but we also need the science to find the solutions. And I don't just mean the scientific understanding and, finding, for example, vaccines against a new disease, but also we need advice for policy design, possibly policy implementation, and later on also for evaluation. However, policy makers and scientists do not necessarily always speak the same language. That's where we come in. As parliamentary research services, for example, and within EPRS, we also have an entity which is called the European Science Media Hub, which has a special role to play in this, and I will mention this later on again. Science advice for policy needs to take on board evidence from different disciplines and perspectives. So we need a holistic approach. And I think this has also been mentioned already before a couple of times. And the pandemic has shown it, in fact, that it is so important that apart from looking at epidemiological models, we also needed to look at other effects, economic ones, or social or psychological effects of the different policy choices. The pandemic also showed us very nicely what we can achieve when we join forces, when we invest in research, data exchange, and collaboration. Producing a vaccine in such a record time is one of the best and rapid achievements in the history of science, but this is not a given. It only works if we don't start from scratch when the crisis hits. The rapid development of vaccines was only possible because the investment in the development of these new types of vaccines started way before. In fact, COVID has shown, and this is in particular also true for COVID-related measures which come into force, support programs, for example, economic support programs in the US and Europe, that it works best what already exists and is not just created on an ad hoc basis as a response to a crisis. In other words, it is essential that we have existing structures and tools instead of designing new policies and tools which need to be tested and implemented, because before they can become effective, it takes time, and sometimes it never works. There are many reasons for this, but we know that both policymakers and administrations will not always get it right if they are under pressure. And and this, that would be a discussion apart for a couple of hours. So I leave it there. Unfortunately, we cannot prepare for everything. We can step up foresight, and we can identify risks and prepare for meeting the gap between risks and capabilities. But there are limits to this. In the area of health policy, Étienne has mentioned our work on risk and capabilities. We have, for example, developed, as in other areas, a whole pyramid of possible measures. And I don't have slides, I apologize for that, but I hold it up. It may not be seen properly, but we have a whole range of activities which can be done at the different levels of government, at national level, and what they can do on their own, things which we can do when we cooperate, things which can be done at the EU level, and so on and so forth. But all these measures will not be enough, because we will never be able to find out exactly which crisis will hit us next. The only thing which is certain is that whenever a next crisis hits us, the disruptive events will impact us all globally, which is one more reason why the role of the European Union, for example, as a crisis manager is expanding and is important. We saw this in the financial crisis, in the pandemic, and now again in the reaction to the Russian aggression in Ukraine and its consequences. And all of this, regardless of if the EU has competence in dealing with it or not. If it doesn't have the competence, there will be an ad hoc this political will to step up. This is always a struggle, but as in the EU health policy, we have seen that if need be, then there's also a way to do it. Finally, risk management and crisis management need to be put together. This is also one of the lessons which have been defined by a newly published paper by the European Commission, done by the group of chief scientific advisors, published a couple of weeks ago, and I can only support this recommendation. My point on communication is as follows. By all our efforts to get science advice for better policy making working, public communication matters. It should be part of the crisis response from the beginning. What is the added value of the quickest ever invented and produced vaccines if the people do not trust them? And when misinformation about science is destroying the confidence in that research. In all this, the relationship between governments and citizens, or more widely, trust is key. And independent of the specific crisis we live through, trust is something which we need in all of this. In the era of social media, where we live in different information environments, this is, of course, even more complicated, but we need structures and tools in place for timely, transparent, and relevant communication based on facts. And that is where I think like our European Science Media Hub comes in, which is a platform for dialogue between policymakers, scientists, and media. in the crisis, we use this platform to be able to quickly react to unfolding events by providing information and interviews with experts and citizens on topics like vaccinations, treatments, dis and misinformation, also like on the EU digital COVID certificate. And all this complemented to other work which we have done in the European Parliament Research Service and in other places. And we have seen that there was a need for this. The amount, the numbers of customers of this platform have really exploded during that time because people wanted to know. And so this proved probably wrong all those people who think that there is no interest in evidence-based policy making it in evidence as such. I come now to my final point, and that's lessons for better lawmaking. Of course, this is very much very important for me as I'm dealing with impact assessment and these kind of things. Decision making in times of crisis is obviously a moment when governments have their high times. This is not usually for parliaments. And governments have to act fast and often without much knowledge about the possible consequences of their doing. They do so under pressure to do something. And so they decide under the condition of extreme uncertainty, where politically for them, only to take no decision would be worse. So this could well be that they get it wrong, but that doesn't mean that it has to be wrong forever. For us as as a parliament representative, what is particularly annoying in all this is that the legislative branch parliaments in these cases are always sidelined. And we are supposed to rubber stamp decisions which have already been taken. And at the European level, there is an Article 122, which is used from the treaties for those who are experts in the treaties, Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union. And most of these urgent decisions are applied with this under this with this specific rule. And of course, parliamentarians will not say no because they're also politicians, and they also don't want to be seen as those who delay actions which could help. So all this creates problems with the quality of decision making and also concerning the democratic legitimacy of those decisions over time. It's hard to swallow for democratically elected bodies such as the European Parliament, but difficult to avoid. However, there are many possible ways to fill the democratic deficit, and not just during the process of decision making, but also during the times of implementation, but notably afterwards by stepping up Parliament's scrutiny role of ex post. The Parliament has, for example, set up a special committee on COVID to examine all aspects of the crisis and how we dealt with it so far. We in EPRS, we are providing studies and other scientific support for this, including on learning how other parliaments dealt with it. This also has been mentioned before. European Parliament is not the only parliament which has not had the high times in this during this crisis. But more important is what else as broader lessons can we learn from COVID and other crises for better lawmaking. One is that democratic oversight and ex post evaluation in times of crisis needs to be strengthened. And the other one is that we can learn for the design of such decisions. We can introduce systematically review and sunset clauses in emergency regulations in order to be able to correct decisions taken at high speed when they turn out to be not fit for purpose or requiring modifications when implemented in practice. In fact, I usually don't like to give figures because, you know, depending on how you calculate figures, they may be wrong, right or wrong, but just to say, to give an idea of the scope of the problem, 2/3 of all COVID-related legislative measures have neither an ex-ante impact assessment nor any kind of review clause. Huh? Yeah, that's simply a fact, and so that doesn't have to be. So overall, I think we should not be afraid of learning from experience, and it's okay to adapt rules and policies based on new knowledge, provided, of course, this is not done on a daily basis, because this would also undermine trust. But from time to time, I think this is totally justified. This includes all our efforts to enhance resilience and to prepare for future crises by building systems which are ready for use and activation without undue delay when they are needed, ideally for multi-use purposes, such as in the area of health policy, for the joint procurement of vaccines at the EU level in a future EU health union, to name just one example. And I will stop here. Maybe just one more sentence, and this is like many of these ideas on how to improve. We have been looking in our European added value work, and there will be a new chapter, a new edition of what we call Mapping of the Cost of Europe, published in January, and we have 3 chapters on EU health policy in this. So in many of the things which are on the table for policy solutions have been already on the table at some stage, but they have not found resonance when there's not a crisis. Huh? One of them is, for example, the temporary insurance for unemployment things, which we have proposed many years ago, but which all had only been taken up when the crisis really hit. So it's not that there's a lack of ideas on the table. It's just that they are used, that there might not be a political will without the crisis. But now I definitely really stop.
Okay, Wolfgang, thank you very much. I thought it was particularly interesting thinking about your last set of points about how we might use law to entrench some of these lessons once we agree on what they are, and indeed ex post and ex ante mechanisms have a life beyond particular parliaments that is very important. So we are past time, but if it's okay with my fellow leaders, or whatever we call ourselves, the leaders is overstating it. If we can just have one round of questions, and then Gabby, I think you're proposing to sum up. So are there any questions either here or? So I have David on my list. Gabby, I'd actually like to put myself on that list. Yeah. Okay, let's start with our Zoom participants, and then we'll go around the table here. So let's kick off with our Zoom participants, and perhaps we'll take that as the first round, and then we can have a second. So yeah, Annette, okay, Anna.
Oh, thank you. I just have a rather simple question to the first presenter. I wondered very much about the idea of context experts. I mean, we see somehow that evidence is never enough. So we don't only have importance of having more of gaining evidence, but the problem itself is not only about evidence, but we have scientists, politicians, and then rather a demos, a third group. But who are then the context experts? So I wonder how far are they different from the scientific experts, and who are they? Can I imagine media actors in it? Can I imagine anybody who would be closer to people who are, for instance, denying any kind of evidence about climate change, evidence about about the working of Western. And so I just found it very, very interesting to speak of an epistemic democracy where you have context experts. So who are these people? Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps Ellen, would you also like to ask your question?
Okay, fine, thank you. Well, we've talked about what policymakers can do in the aftermath and during a crisis, what we as scientists can do in order to make better advice. But I wonder if there are further views on what the public can also do. Just to refer to the fact that here the public in Belgium is still very strict whenever a so-called mistake has been made, a mistake by a politician who has taken a wrong turn, or by a scientist and so on. So for me, I kind of feel okay, democracy has to evolve as well, and probably be more open and receptive to some level of failure, not huge, of course, but at least be more acceptable to the fact that indeed we're all humans, also the scientists trying to find an answer to problems, but of course everything is not black or white. So I would like to hear some more views on that. Thank you.
Well, I'll hand over to our panel members, and perhaps they can answer, and then we'll have a round of questions again.
I think both questions are a little bit related. So who are the context experts? This might be a little bit of a cop-out, but you need to answer that question in a context-dependent way. So who are the context experts will depend on the context. But I mean, I'll try to give a more intelligent answer, perhaps. If we're talking about school closures, right? Who are those best placed to speak about the impact of school closures on children, on parents and working parents, families. So that's one example of context expert. The people who are affected by the issue, those who have the experience, the knowledge on the ground, if you like. It's easy for me to say that, yeah, we need to bring together context experts and content experts. And I think I've been a little bit simplistic in that, because I need to acknowledge the difficulties of bringing together what might sometimes be incommensurable types of knowledge. But I think we need to make the effort. I can't remember if it was Wolfgang or Annette that said that, Annette has mentioned earlier that politicians should decide, not scientists. But that works fine in a model of representative democracy, where politicians are actually able to represent different constituencies. We live in a society that is multicultural, multifaceted, fragmented, polarized, and the ability of those politicians or scientific experts to bring together different views and different interests to the table, unfortunately, is limited. And what I was trying to suggest is that we need to extend our definition of expertise to include other forms of knowledge. There's an interesting experiment in this regard, I think, of which I know very little, and I'm hoping to do some research and investigate this case in a bit more detail. But in Singapore, the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore set up a series of public conversations, and I think they called them emerging stronger conversations. And those conversations were kind of articulated around particular topics, around the issue of women, around the issue of education and health, etc., etc. And were conversations, were public fora that brought together civil society, scientists, politicians, not so much to make decisions, but to understand the problem, to articulate concerns, and to look forward, to emerge stronger. I think that's an interesting proposition, an interesting model that we could perhaps explore further as a way to bring together all those who have a stake in the problem to have a say.
Well, the question, what can the public do, is a difficult one. It touches about the quality of our democratic culture of dialogue. And I would make it myself very easy if I say, well, accepting different views and achieving compromise is a value, because in real politics, of course, parties and media try to sharpen the discourse in order to be noticed, and they live from conflict in many ways. We tend to forget this in the European Parliament very often, because while we have political conflict and political positions, it's a house which needs to compromise and does compromise much more than in other political cultures, or in other political situations where you usually have governments and oppositions which needs to fight each other, and whatever the government does is bad, in the view of the opposition. And vice versa. But it really is a question of discourse culture. And I think what has been said early on a couple of times is very valuable and important, that we have to accept that there is diversity out. There's diversity in who we are, but also in what we think. There's diversity even in how we interpret facts and so on. There are, of course, facts which may be undisputable, but there are also many others where we can have different views on them. And we have to accept this and learn about this. But this, if I had a really satisfactory answer on how to do all this, I would probably not be here as a civil servant anymore, but would get a lot of money as a campaign advisor somewhere from someone. So I'm afraid that my answer will be pretty unsatisfactory, but I think it has to do with the level of the democratic culture, and how we deal with questions of that kind in general.
If I may, I agree to what I fully agree to what Maru said, that people both in politics and in science, of course, are highly selective, and that there are so many interests and perspectives and life realities which don't have aren't represented in any way. We have had a debate on lay experts already in the 1990s, when policy making was shocked based on the BSE crisis on the role of scientific expertise. Then we have had this debate already. I know about some texts of the 1995, 1996 of scientists suggesting this, but we haven't come very far with this. We do have a model which may come close to this, and these are the civic councils in climate policy, which are representative. This is very, very important, because with all innovative procedures of participation, there's a strong social bias. The more you are educated and you have income, the more you participate, and vice versa. But these civic councils in climate policy are fully representative, and they have a good record. I mean, you can't have them all the time and everywhere, but they have a very good record in producing results and raising acceptance and awareness and all these things. Maybe we should think into this direction.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's go around the table. David, Gabby, and
I think we should let these.
Okay.
You and I should waive our rights.
Right. Okay. Well. Okay.
No, thank you very much for all the presentation. I have more comments than questions, but I found particularly interesting what Professor Mormina proposed in terms of a polycrisis, and also the comparison between short-term crises like the one that we witnessed with COVID-19 and the long-term one like climate change, where complexity exactly is also facing different time frames and also pressures. I think that on this point, probably the problem of complexity is a key concept that should be probably more conceptualized, because expertise is basically something at the same time specific, so that it has to solve very specific things. So it is an operation that need to basically reduce complexity and dissect, let's say, a problem into levels of sub-problems. So in this case, it had to create some borders between things, then expertise, and then spaces also of interaction with people bringing in different type of expertise. For example, I'm thinking about a paper written by Sarevitz that points out how basically putting too much knowledge into a controversy can sometimes not just, positively announce the resolution of a controversy, but can make controversy worse, because we are overloading of information participants. You are probably putting too much meat, let's say, into the debate. So it can also negatively affect the deliberation, for example, on a specific problem. Let aside the fact that you have quite clear time pressures, for example, during the COVID-19 crisis. Also, I think it's very interesting to see the political aspect of building institutions of expert advice. Since here, for example, I think an important concept that has been proposed by Bruno Latour, for example, was the concept of enrollment. So the fact that you basically already decide how to frame a problem, how to pose a question. So that's the political and performative part of knowing something, but there is already something performative, something political in framing what you want to solve and the goal you want to achieve. And in this sense, enrolling experts means that you are bringing experts with a specific criteria that makes of them expert relevant for the problem you want to achieve, and so for the political, let's say, framing that you have already made. Then one last thing is about the mandate of experts. So basically, what does it mean to have a mandate for an expert? Is it a mandate in terms of knowledge mandate? Is it like a boundary making activity within knowing and making things? So I think this is something that I would really appreciate to discuss with you, also connected to the European Parliament and to how we basically rediscuss the design of institutions, of expert institutions. But thanks a lot for all the many insights you proposed today.
Okay. You've made quite a few points. I'm not sure I can address them all, but I've taken some notes. Let me start with the first point you made, which I think is the question of, an expert is called to break down the problem, so to go down to the manageable bits of the problem. I agree. But I think, and here I'm going to kind of talk about something I don't know much about, which is system theory, complexity theory, right? So maybe some of you will be more familiar with this. But my understanding is that when we talk about, complexity or system thinking, we need to do a process of zooming in and zooming out, zooming in and zooming out. I'm not saying that, going to breaking down the process into manageable parts, so understand kind of the mechanics of how a virus works is not important. But what I'm saying is that in isolation is not useful knowledge if you don't know how those mechanics, those molecular mechanisms interact with the physiology, interact with, the environment, etc., etc. It's a kind of zooming in and zooming out process that we need to engage in. And I fear that if we work within parameters of very narrow conceptions of expertise, we become really good at zooming in, but we don't become very competent at zooming out. The second point, I think, was about the time pressure. I wrote a paper recently, and the peer reviewers came back making precisely that point. So I had to think about it, and I had to provide a response. So I think I can say something about the time pressure. Yes, it's true. There is time pressure, but you know, it's not that decisions have to be made from one minute to the next. And I really liked Ellen's graph showing the plot between number of cases and the different types of learning. And one would expect that when the cases are low, you engage in that sort of horizon scanning, kind of blue sky thinking. And it was exactly the opposite. It was when the cases went up that the social learning kicked in, because people realized that, well, actually, the tweaking of policies and processes is not working. We here need some more radical thinking. So yes, time pressure, I agree. But you know, Ellen's graph is very telling in that you also need those sort of radical and system complex system thinking. Your third point, I think it was around the political framing, and I couldn't agree more with you. So we talk a lot about evidence-based policy, but the reality is that we're most of the times we do policy-based evidence. And now I think we need to, and that's why I feel that I mentioned in my intervention, the need for broadening the terms of reference of what science advice can and should do, who can participate, and what questions they can answer. And that is a political decision. So we can't talk about reformation of science advice or improving science advice without also talking about the need to improve the democratic process. And the final point was the mandate of experts. And I don't have an answer for that. What is the mandate of experts? I think, I don't know. I think I would like to think that an expert is a convener, that an expert is someone who's able to convene relevant knowledge. So when we appoint an expert to an advisory body, whether it's Neil Ferguson or whether it's anybody, the role of that expert is to gather views, to understand, to interpret. And I wouldn't want to think that their mandate is to position themselves as the purveyors of truth. Their mandate would be to position themselves as conveners. I'm not entirely sure if that is a satisfactory answer, because I hadn't thought of it before, but it's what comes to mind.
Peter, I think maybe we should look at.
Yeah, I agree, David. Okay, so I think in the interest of time, I'll now hand over to Gabby to take us away with a summary.
Thanks a lot. I don't want to cut you short. Is that a question that you, or a remark?
No, I just wanted to ask question to Wolfgang Hiller, because you mentioned impact assessment and COVID, and I was wondering what is your opinion on the integration of impact assessment and foresight, especially in light of good evidence and evidence-based policies and before crisis. Thanks.
I think I can answer this very briefly. Well, foresight, in any case, is a useful tool in all situations, because it's trying to see what kind of potential futures we will engage in, and depending on what we do, these futures will change. And so to map out this future and with probabilities and possible changes of the avenue, how these futures will come is useful in any case, always. The ex-ante impact assessment at least in the European Union philosophy kicks in when we have policy proposals on the table, and they are accompanying these policy proposals, and they usually are very concrete, they're done for very concrete suggestions that takes sometimes years because it's a complicated process, and that is useful. In order to get the policy design correct, it includes, in fact, something I tend to explain it usually in very simple terms to people who never know anything about the impact. It's what you are supposed to do at home as well. If you have a problem, you define or you try to find out what the problem is really is. You then try to discuss it maybe with others in the context of impact assessment with stakeholders, and in order to find alternative options, and then you evaluate these options, and then you choose these options, and then at the end of the day, you align your decision hopefully with it. That's at least in theory like this, and the only difference between an ex-ante impact assessment at the political level is that this is also always put on paper so that others can see for the purpose of transparency. But this process is, I think, the important thing about it. And if you have a problem you didn't expect, then you don't have time for it because you're supposed to make a decision. Well, that's tough, but that's happening. And that's why I say, you need to build up some controls or some possibilities to later on to correct these decisions if they turn out to be wrong. That's all, because we think in policy cycle terms that all problems usually are solved one way or another, but you evaluate later on if the decision is correct, and then you change again. It's quite normal. You also do it in life. Basically, you have been buying something, and it turns out not to be the best thing, then you buy something new, and it's a cycle. So ex-ante impact assessment is important. It should not be abused. It's quite costly also. And sometimes, we need to provide an ex-ante impact assessment also when members ask us for it. But very often, to be honest, it's for policy-based evidence making. They don't want to see alternatives. They want to have just one, the one which they have agreed on beforehand as a majority position, which should be the way forward. That's not exactly what is the purpose of it, but I guess I'll stop.
The impossible thing of summing this super rich and mega interesting discussion that we had today up in 2 minutes. And I appreciate all your overtime, and I'm very thankful that you give this resource to us. So quickly, we had 3 main topics: diversity, pluralism, which is important for us to design policies that are effective and that last longer; institutionalization and architecture. So rather than ad hoc going to institutionalize, but broaden that. Third point, complexity, literacy, and contestation. So both on the side of the experts and policymakers, but also on the public. So we need to be literate about evolving situations, requiring us to push our boundaries of tolerance for policy discourse, for discussion about solutions, and for societal decision-making about the preferred solutions. This is the one part on the 3 topics that I think were horizontal across all contributions. Second part, conclusion, I do think that we need to get our heads around the fact that policymaking is currently a mode in emerging situations, that we will not be, that anticipatory policymaking, foresight and assessment will need to be something that we base our policies already now on, because we will not come to a conclusion where we say, this solution, we implement it, we are fine. I do think this is what Maru said with this post-normal moment we are in, and we are there to remain in that. So we need to adapt that and go more into anticipatory policymaking that also embraces a stronger institutionalization of the science-advised architecture. Third point, what we haven't discussed is introspection. That's very interesting, and I think we should do that in a second in the next workshop, actually. So challenges, how does what we discuss, what we have discussed today, challenge our own understanding of academia and science? in terms of what we reward as engagement, how we train the future generations, what we accept as merits in promotional systems, because a lot of science advice currently of those not in positions, permanent positions, is on a voluntary basis. So how do we adapt so that we enable and empower future generations of scientists and academics to really do a good job in a way that benefits both society, policymaking, and their own academic trajectory? One point we didn't discuss is how do we deal with bias disclaimers ourselves? Right? Annette, you mentioned that to make clear what is a research result, evidence base, and what is a political opinion that I express. So do we indeed have to go for bias disclaimers ourselves? I'm doing this research coming from this and this school, have this and this interest in politics. We haven't discussed that. I think it's quite important. Finally, what we haven't discussed is what does this do to institutional logics? Wolfgang alluded to that already. It requires policymakers, so those engaged in the preparation of policies, public officials, to be extremely open to learning on the job, to change, to absorb new methods, assessment types, so to have a liquid and an evolving professional career. At the same time, most big public administrations don't give room for that, right? Both in terms of professional development, but also of acknowledging that this liquidity is part of the job. So training on the job and further evolving. Actually, Alan, I'd like to close with something that you had in your slides and that stuck with me and will do so. So using science as a science itself. And that came very much through in our discussion, and we need to engage in understanding this science exactly in a way that Paul and Maru, that you did, with frameworks of how to categorize experts, also to broaden to label also those that are currently not in the system. And finally, the fourth point that I want to make close with, please let's try to make this our research and your super rich experience, policy and politics relevant. So very concretely, let's see how we can cooperate on making something, injecting the ideas into policies and policy making, and to be ourselves a link to improve what we want to research with all the difficulties of embedment and involvement that this brings. I thank you all very much. It was such a good workshop. I learned tremendously much, and I appreciate all of your knowledge that you brought to the table, and hope we stay in contact for future cooperations. Thank you very much.